Let him have it, Chris. I must have written those words in my notebook a dozen times that winter. 3 short words, but they've echoed in my head for years. Let him have it. Was it an order to shoot or a plea to surrender? Even now I'm not sure. When I close my eyes, I can still hear the courtroom hush as they were spoken aloud. I can see the jurors lean in, the judge scowling down, the boy in the dock shifting nervously. Let him have it, Chris, the words that sent a 19-year-old to the gallows. But before they made history, before they became a headline and a rallying cry, they were just words shouted on a rooftop in Croydon on a cold November night. It started as an ordinary day. I was a junior crime reporter, chasing stories of burglaries, scuffles, the small dramas of South London life. Croydon was no stranger to that sort of thing. Dark alleys, shuttered warehouses, kids with more cheek than sense. When the call came in about 2 lads seen climbing a drain pipe, I expected nothing more than a routine write-up. A quick line in the evening edition, maybe buried under the football scores. But that night turned out to be anything but routine. By dawn, a policeman would lie dead, another wounded, and Britain would be arguing over the meaning of a phrase that could damn a boy or save him. I was there, pen in hand, scribbling every detail. And though decades have passed, I still find myself asking, what did Derek Bentley mean when he cried out, "Let him have it, Chris"? I first came across the name Derek Bentley long before the trial. His file sat in the Croydon police station blotter more than once. Petty thefts, nothing remarkable. Just the kind of things young lads drift into when they've got too much time and too little guidance. But Derek wasn't like the other boys. You could see that straight off. Born in 1933, raised in South London, he'd grown up in the shadow of war, while other lads his age were running messages for ARP wardens or mucking about on bomb sites. Derek was in and out of hospitals. A fall as a child left him with fits, what the doctors called epilepsy, and he was never quite the same after. He had headaches that would floor him, and his schooling suffered badly. By the time he reached his teens, the teachers said he had the mind of a boy half his age. Couldn't read or write properly. Tests later put his IQ at 66. To most people that's just a number, but to Derek it meant a world where he was always a step behind, struggling to keep up, never quite fitting in. I remember talking to one of his neighbours, a kindly old lady from down the road. She told me he was harmless, that boy. Quiet. Never raised his voice, just wanted to be liked. That stayed with me. Of course, harmless or not, the law saw things differently. In 1948, when he was just 15, he was caught nicking from a shop. Petty, clumsy stuff. They sent him off to an approved school. It was meant to set him straight, but really it just introduced him to other boys already headed the wrong way. That's where he met a wiry little lad called Christopher Craig. Neither of them knew it then, but that friendship would write both their names into history. It was a damp Sunday night in Croydon, the sort of night where the fog clings to the rooftops and every sound carries. Around 9 o'clock, 2 figures were spotted climbing a drain pipe on Tamworth Road. Nothing unusual for us on the crime desk. Croydon had more than its freight of break-ins. But this one was different. The younger lad was Christopher Craig, 16, sharp-eyed, quick with his hands, and far too fond of showing off. He wasn't just carrying lockpicks or a crowbar. In his jacket was a .455 Colt revolver, the barrel sawn down, stuffed with a jumble of bullets that barely matched the chamber. He liked the bravado of it, being the boy with a gun. Derek Bentley followed behind him. 19 years old, but, in many ways, still a child. He wasn't armed with anything more deadly than a knife and a brass knuckle Craig had given him. I remember noting in my pad that night, Bentley didn't fire a shot. That fact would matter later, though not nearly enough. Neighbours heard the clatter on the drain pipe and phoned the police. Before long, officers had sealed the street. A plainclothes detective, Frederick Fairfax, was first up the ladder to the roof. He grabbed Bentley, wrestled with him, and for a moment Derek broke free. Then came the shout, Fairfax yelling to Craig to hand over the gun, and Bentley's voice cutting across the rooftop. "Let him have it, Chris." Some swore they heard it clear as day. Others weren't sure. But those 5 words, shouted in the dark above Croydon, would seal Derek's fate. Craig didn't pause to debate. He raised the revolver and fired. Detective Constable Fairfax, the man who'd grabbed Bentley, cried out as a bullet tore into his shoulder. Wounded but defiant, Fairfax clung on, pinning Derek down. And there Bentley stayed, not fighting, not fleeing, held fast while the rooftop battle raged around him. By then more police were swarming below, some climbing the warehouse to join the chase. Among them was Police Constable Sidney Miles, a 42-year-old father and veteran officer. He scrambled up onto the roof with nothing more than a torch and a truncheon. A moment later, Craig fired again, 1 shot. PC Miles dropped instantly, struck in the head. I can still recall the way the pressman described it afterwards. A single fatal bullet and a policeman dead in the line of duty. The law had little patience for such things. Shooting a constable was as close to sacrilege as crime could get. It hardened public mood and sealed the fate of anyone tied to the deed, whether they pulled the trigger or not. Craig kept firing wildly until his pockets ran dry. Cornered, he hurled himself from the roof, breaking bones in the fall, but living to be dragged off to hospital and then to custody. Bentley was already in police hands. He hadn't fired a single shot. But it didn't matter. A policeman was dead, and under English law, anyone involved in that night's crime would carry the weight of murder on their shoulders. The trial opened that December, and for 3 days the Old Bailey was packed to the rafters. I remember the chill in the courtroom air, the shuffle of reporters on the press bench, our pencils ready to catch every word. This wasn't just another murder case. A policeman had been killed, and all of London wanted blood. Lord Chief Justice Goddard presided, tall, severe, with eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. He had a reputation for being hard as nails, and he lived up to it. From the start, the weight of the court felt against Bentley. The prosecution made much of those 5 words. Let him have it, Chris. Over and over they painted them as a command to shoot. Fairfax swore he heard them. 2 other officers backed him. It was, they argued, proof that Bentley was as guilty as the boy who pulled the trigger. The defence tried to fight back. Bentley, they said, was simple-minded, barely able to read, with the mind of a child. If he said anything at all, perhaps he meant Craig should hand over the gun. I watched Derek in the dock, fidgeting with his hands, wide-eyed, not quite following what was being said about him. He didn't look like a man plotting murder. He looked like a boy lost in a grown-up's game. Then came the police statement. A written confession, they called it, signed with Derek's scrawl. It included the line, "I did not know he was going to use the gun." The Crown twisted it into meaning he knew Craig had one all along. Some of us scribbled it down and wondered if those were Derek's words at all. He couldn't write, and the turns of phrase felt oddly polished, but the jury never heard doubts about that. By the 3rd day, it was over, both lads found guilty. The jury asked for mercy in Derek's case, but mercy was thin on the ground. Lord Goddard pulled on the black cap. Craig was spared the rope because of his age. Derek Bentley, 19 years old, was sentenced to hang. Once the sentence was passed, the fight moved beyond the Old Bailey. On Fleet Street, we knew the next step would be a petition for mercy, and this time the public were with us. I remember walking past Parliament and seeing MPs with sheets of signatures, more than 200 of them calling for a reprieve. Newspapers ran editorials, ordinary folk posted letters begging the Home Secretary to spare the boy, but the mood in Whitehall was colder. The Home Secretary, David Maxwell Fyfe, held Bentley's life in his hands. He could advise the Queen to grant clemency. Everyone waited to see if he'd bend. After all, the jury themselves had asked for mercy. Even Lord Goddard had forwarded the plea, though he'd added pointedly that he found no reason to support it. Behind closed doors, Fyfe weighed his options. A policeman had been killed, and in those days that counted for everything. To show mercy, he believed, would look like weakness. I heard whispers from civil servants that he felt tied by the letter of the law, unwilling to interfere with the court's decision. Meanwhile, the streets outside told a different story. Crowds gathered at meetings, voices rising in anger. Campaigners marched with placards, mothers and fathers wrote to the papers calling it a grievous mistake. Some even compared it to hanging a child given Derek's mind. But none of it mattered. On the 13th of January 1953, the Court of Appeal turned down Bentley's appeal. A week later, Maxwell Fyfe rejected the petition. The sentence stood. I remember putting the phone down after the news broke. The newsroom fell silent. Even the clatter of typewriters paused. We all knew what that meant. Derek Bentley would hang. The morning of the 28th of January 1953 is etched in my memory. Bitter cold, frost on the pavement, a grey sky hanging low over Wandsworth. By 9 o'clock the crowd had swelled outside the prison gates. Men in flat caps, women clutching scarves tight against the wind, all waiting for the notice to be pinned. I was there, notebook in hand, though for once words felt useless. Some people prayed, others shouted. Campaigners from the anti-hanging groups held placards. Police officers kept their distance, uneasy in the face of so much anger. Then, right on the stroke of 9, the black-bordered notice went up. Derek Bentley had been executed. A ripple went through the crowd, and then it broke. Shouts, cries, the crash of glass as men tore at the frame and smashed it to pieces. I remember one woman yelling, "Murderers!" at the warders behind the gates. Inside, it was all over in seconds. Albert Pierrepoint, the hangman, was efficient as ever. He led Derek from his cell, calm and businesslike. Derek, by all accounts, thought for a moment Pierrepoint had come with a reprieve. The hangman wore no hood, just an ordinary suit. For a fleeting second, hope crossed his face. Then it was gone. By the time the trapdoor fell, Derek Bentley was 19 years old. Too young to vote, too unwell to properly understand the world around him, yet old enough for the state to put a rope around his neck. Outside, the anger lingered. I wrote my piece that day, but as I packed away my pencil, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had all witnessed not justice, but a tragedy. In the days that followed, London was unsettled. The headlines declared justice had been done, but the letters pages told a different story. Ordinary men and women wrote in by the dozen, some furious, some heartbroken. The phrase that kept cropping up was a miscarriage of justice. Even in the pubs, you'd hear it muttered over pints. Not everyone believed the right man had swung. For Derek's family, it wasn't just words in the papers. His parents buried their son and carried the weight of knowing the law had marked him as a murderer. But it was his sister Iris who took up the fight. She was only a teenager when Derek died, but as she grew older, she became relentless. Year after year she petitioned, she wrote letters, she cornered politicians. I remember seeing her once on the steps of the Home Office in the 1970s, clutching a folder of documents and speaking with a voice that never wavered. The decades rolled on, but the doubts never faded. Writers and campaigners joined the chorus, unpicking the trial, pointing out the holes in the evidence, questions about Derek's confession, about the judge's bias, about what those 5 words really meant. All of it came back into the light. By the early 1990s, it was no longer just a family's crusade. It was a national question mark hanging over the justice system. In 1993, 40 years after the gallows at Wandsworth, Derek finally received a royal pardon, but only for the sentence, not the conviction. Iris wasn't satisfied. She pressed on, her health failing, but her resolve unshaken. And then, in 1998 came the moment she had fought for all her life. The Court of Appeal quashed Derek Bentley's conviction. At last the record was set straight. I wasn't a young man by then, I'd filled countless notebooks in the years between. But I'll never forget the relief on the faces of Derek's surviving family, or the quiet dignity of those who had carried his memory through decades of grief. While Derek Bentley's name filled the headlines, Christopher Craig's story slipped quietly into the background. He was just 16 when he fired that revolver, too young by law to face the rope. Instead, he was sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, an open-ended term that meant prison until the authorities saw fit. Craig grew up behind bars. By the time he walked free in 1963, he was 23. 10 years of his youth had been spent in a cell. When I checked in on him years later, I found a man who had tried to put the past behind him. He married, took up work as a plumber, and kept out of trouble. For decades he lived quietly, away from the public eye. But the past never truly went away. Whenever the Bentley case came back into the news, Craig's name resurfaced. He never wavered in one thing, he always insisted Derek hadn't told him to shoot. He never said it, Craig told interviewers more than once. And even if the words were spoken, he said, they weren't meant as an order to kill. There were rumours too about that fatal bullet. The revolver Craig carried was a battered old thing, mismatched bullets rattling in the chamber. Some wondered whether PC Miles might even have been struck by a stray police round in the chaos. Craig himself claimed he never aimed at the constable, but those questions were left unanswered. The only certainty was that a good officer lost his life that night. When the Court of Appeal finally cleared Derek's name in 1998, Craig broke his silence again. By then, he was an old man. He welcomed the decision, saying Derek's innocence had at last been recognised. He even apologised to the families, to the Bentleys and to PC Miles's relatives for the tragedy of that night. He lived with the knowledge that his actions had ended one man's life and cost another his neck. For Christopher Craig, that must have been a heavier sentence than any judge could impose. The more time passed, the more the Bentley case refused to lie quiet. By the 1970s and 80s, researchers and campaigners were unpicking every thread, and what they found made the original trial look shaky at best. Take Derek's so-called confession. The police read it in court as if it were gospel, a neat little document signed at the bottom. But Derek couldn't write more than his own name. Linguists who studied the statement years later said the language was all wrong. Polished phrases, turns of speech a boy with the mind of an 11-year-old would never have used. To my mind, it read more like the words of the officers taking it down than those of the frightened youth they were questioning. Then there was the judge himself. Lord Goddard was respected in his day, but by modern standards his summing up was nothing short of biased. He told the jury Derek was mentally aiding the murder, practically pushing them towards a guilty verdict. And he never made clear the most important point of all, that to convict Derek, they had to be sure he even knew Craig was armed that night. It was a glaring omission, but in 1952, no one dared challenge the Lord Chief Justice. And what of the bullet that killed P.C. Miles? It was never recovered. Craig's revolver was an ancient thing, the wrong-sized bullets clattering in the chamber. Some experts later wondered whether it could even have fired the fatal shot with such accuracy. Others floated darker suggestions, that in the chaos it might have been a stray round from another gun on the roof. We'll never know for certain. Piece by piece, the evidence of a miscarriage of justice piled up. To those of us who'd followed the case from the start, it was both vindication and heartbreak. Vindication, because the doubts we scribbled in our notebooks were real. Heartbreak, because it was all too late for Derek Bentley. The Bentley case didn't just end with a hanging in 1953. It rippled through the years, shaping how Britain thought about crime, punishment, and the law itself. When the death penalty was suspended in the mid-1960s and then abolished for murder, Derek's name was on many people's lips. Along with Timothy Evans, another young man wrongly executed, Bentley became proof that the gallows could claim the innocent as easily as the guilty. Parliamentarians pointed to his story when they argued the case. Once a life is taken, it cannot be returned. The law on joint enterprise also came under scrutiny. In Derek's day, simply being present at a crime could be enough to share full guilt for a killing. It was a blunt instrument designed to make examples of gangs, but Bentley's fate exposed the cruelty of holding a vulnerable bystander as responsible as the boy who pulled the trigger. Over the decades, judges and campaigners chipped away at the doctrine, insisting on clearer tests of intent and foresight. It took years, but his case was always part of that conversation. For his family, the legacy was more personal. They fought for decades, not for headlines, but for justice. When the Court of Appeal finally quashed his conviction in 1998, it wasn't just a victory for the Bentleys. It was a moment when Britain admitted the system had failed. I was in the press gallery that day too, much older, greyer and slower with my pen. But I remember the hush as the judgment was read and the tears on the faces of Derek's surviving relatives. Looking back now, I think Bentley's story taught Britain a lesson in humility. Justice is not infallible. Courts can err, judges can mislead, and if the punishment is death, the error can never be undone. I sometimes look back at my old notebook from those days. The pages are yellowed now, the pencil marks faded, but one line stands out as clear as ever. Let him have it, Chris. I underlined it twice, not realizing at the time that those words would hang a boy. I've covered many cases in my career, but none has lingered like this one. I can still see Derek Bentley in the dock, fidgeting, eyes wide, as if half the trial passed over his head. I can still feel the cold outside Wandsworth that January morning, the anger of the crowd as the notice went up, and I can still hear the silence in the Court of Appeal 45 years later, when at last the conviction was struck down. What haunts me most is the thought that it might all have been avoided, if mercy had been shown, if the judge had been fairer, if those 5 words had been heard differently. History can't be rewritten, but it can be remembered, and perhaps that's the least we owe Derek Bentley. So I leave you with this question. Derek never pulled the trigger. He was already under arrest when the fatal shot was fired. Was it justice to hang him? Or was it a tragic failure that shows us how fragile justice can be? I'd like to hear what you think.